May God be in these words and in our hearing of them. Well, Mary read for us a passage, and it's probably a passage that at least a good number of you could say from memory. It's one that we hear quite a bit, and that's because it's a pretty important one. And you know the characters in this. We've got Jesus and the Pharisees. And if you are like me, you probably think of Jesus as the good guy, which would put the Pharisees in the bad guys role. And the Pharisees sort of fit that role a lot for us. They're almost always in stories in opposition to Jesus, or at least in tension with something that Jesus is saying or doing. We think of the Pharisees as the bad guys because we know Jesus is the good guy. Jesus is the authority. But if you were hearing this when it was being originally said, back when Jesus was alive, the Pharisees would have been the authority. As Mary read, the one who asked the question, which is the greatest commandment, was an expert in the law. The Pharisees were the experts. They were the authority for the whole world on what you do, what you believe, and how you live if you are a follower of God. Jesus was the one who was the maverick. He was the one who was outside of the conventions, outside of their traditional authority and ruffling the feathers. The Pharisees were the ones who were actually in control if you had asked any of the people living back then. And in this passage, the whole chapter preceding, the Pharisees and Sadducees are doing their best to play stump Jesus. They are asking Jesus tough questions, questions that really even don't seem like they have a right answer. They ask, which is the greatest commandment? That's probably on par with asking a parent, which is your favorite kid? They're all great. And so they're trying to stump Jesus because he's the maverick. He's the one who's outside of the recognized authority. It was their job to determine who was right and wrong and how to interpret the scripture. And Jesus does what Jesus does. He hears their question and answers it in a pure Jesus way that leaves them sort of fuming because they can't possibly argue with it. And so they go off and sort of mutter under their breath, and that's that. Jesus says, if you want to understand the law and to follow it, you need to first truly love God and love other people. Until you do that, you'll never be able to truly follow the law. Now, the Pharisees were the experts on the law. They were pretty sure that following the law was what they were already doing. In fact, they were the experts. They had built their whole lives around following the law. Orthodoxy, believing the right thing. Orthopraxy, doing the right thing. And then they told everybody else how to do it. And Jesus is saying, the Pharisees have missed the point. That's a big deal. So, when I was a little girl, about 8 or 9, I was an avid reader. And I had read a story and wanted to tell my mom about it. And so I was telling her all about what had happened and the characters, and the main character, I talked about her a lot. Her name was Penelope. And I told my mom all about Penelope and the things that she was doing. And after the second or third time, my mom stopped me and said, "Annie, I think it's Penelope." And I said, "No, her name is Penelope. I read the book." My mom had not read the book. Her name was Penelope. And when I was preparing this message, I called my mom and I asked her if she remembered that. And she said, "Oh, of course I remember that." It was kind of an inside joke for us for a while. And I asked her if she could remember anything about the story, and she said, "No." The interesting thing was, neither of us could remember a single thing about the story. Not the plot, not the other characters, not even the title. All we could remember was Penelope and my insistence on being right. My insistence on being right had completely eclipsed the rest of the story. That's what's happening here. That's what happened to the Pharisees. That's what Jesus is trying to break through. They were so concerned with correctness, with the boundaries that they had created, with the rules that they had set around themselves, that they had missed the point. See, the rules were never supposed to be the focus. The rules were a means to the end goal. Like me, the Pharisees had read the book. They knew what it said. Most of these Pharisees had even memorized huge portions of Scripture, and they lectured and talked about these Scriptures. They had committed them to their hearts, and of course, they thought they knew what they were talking about. They knew what they said. And they had drawn up rule after rule and created these intricate ways of following these rules, down to the number of steps you could take on the Sabbath. And they had done that based on their interpretation of Scripture. The Pharisees weren't trying to be bad guys. They were trying to follow God. And they had drawn up these rules. They had decided what was acceptable and unacceptable, who was acceptable and unacceptable, who could worship God and how and where and when, and who was outside of those boundaries, off limits from God, from God's people, who is in and who is out. Now, I said before, we think of the Pharisees as bad guys. And church, we are the Pharisees. Now, I don't say that in a name-calling, feel really bad kind of way, but we are in exactly the same position as the church today that the Pharisees were in Jesus' day. We are the main authority for the rest of the world on how to live lives that glorify God. We're the main authority on what to do if you're trying to obey God. We are the keepers of the Scripture, and we structure our whole lives around following God. But all of those things make us prone to exactly the same shortcomings, short-sightedness that the Pharisees were prone to. We are so focused on being right that many